I'll get right into my topic. So today's I'm going to talk to you guys about evolution of microservices architecture. But before I go into the thing, let me first congratulate the team which has put this event together. It has been hard during this COVID times to get together, but I think the team worked extremely hard to go through. I think we got almost like about 200 entries of for the talks, and it's a very tough task to select only 20 out of them. But please do stay for the whole conference. You will get to see exciting material. And someone asked whether we'll have a recording. Of course, we'll have recordings of each sessions. We will put it on the YouTube channel. We will have recordings available for all of you guys to see. Okay, so before I go, there's one more thing which I wanted to talk to you guys about. Please be engaged in your chat. Please pass on your comments, your questions. We'll have time for Q&A at fixed intervals during this time, so that like you can, the speakers can answer your questions. And also, we want encourage you guys to go to the social media and be encourage your speakers. Okay, with that, I will get started. We'll also have a lot of prizes. I think Vishal already covered those things in between the sessions. We will reiterate what those things will going to be. Okay, now let us get started. Okay, when you talk about microservices, you all must be thinking, okay, why are we talking about microservices, right? So it's always good to start with why. All of us have read this famous book, always start with why. Now, when I look at how the software has evolved, if you see all the patterns, you will see that microservices is right at the late majority stage, right? What it means is microservices is no longer cool. It has been used, and it is almost like the grandfather of architectures right now. The latest cool thing, if you see, we are talking about async API, we're talking about blockchain. If they are the latest cool kids on the block, microservices is the granddaddy. So it is high time you all know the evolution which microservices took to reach to this place. And it is really important for us to understand the choices and the design decisions which people have made, which will make you a better engineer and a better architect. So let me start with why we create architectures. So my first thing, which I always say, the most preferred thing about architecture is avoid architecture, right? So if you can avoid doing something, don't do it, right? The second thing comes is reduce, right? So reduce the amount of architecture which you have to create, right? Reduce the amount of design which you need to create. Try to make it as necessary as possible. Don't over-engineer. Then the third part comes is reuse. Don't keep reinventing the wheel. Reuse the patterns and reuse the components which people have developed earlier. So try to reuse those patterns. The same thing with respect to microservices. Then fourth thing comes to is recycle. Now, when we say recycle, what is the difference between reuse and recycle? Reuse is reusing as it is. Recycle is where you extend it, or you compose it, or you aggregate it, right? But you're still reusing the thing, right? But recycle is like taking the same material and repurposing it, right? But you're getting the lot of benefit about the thing. Then the next part is recover. Recover is basically you're dismantling and recovering parts of the architecture, right? You may not be able to use the whole thing, so you'll use some parts of the architecture. Then comes treat, right? So, and dispose. So treat is like this. This actually comes, if you see all of this is actually from waste recycling, right? So how does waste recycling apply to software engineer? Because I seriously believe 80% of the stuff which we do is really unnecessary and wasted, right? If you use the right patterns and right architecture, we can do better stuff, and we can be a lot more efficient and a lot more cheaper. Now, I want to go into the next section, which talks about where did we start, right? So the reuse always started with saying that, okay, if you have an in-process things, you started with a humble jump statement. So when you're writing the code again and again in assembly instructions, people decided, if I have written the code to add two numbers already, why do I have to do it again and again? Let me just jump to that place and jump back. So it started with jump. Once you put syntactic sugar in the high level languages, it becomes functions, classes, and then threads are also nothing but jump statements, but they are like, they have like more context. They take care of more memory protections. So this is how the reuse started, right? People started saying that, okay, if you have a piece of code, if you want to reuse, recycle, all those things which I talked about, avoid writing it again, you put it in a function or you put it in a class. Then came saying that, okay, all this works great if I have a monolithic single process application. Once it becomes out of process, what I do? So then came little bit more complex technologies. I don't know kids out here who are not even born when I started doing with COM. Lucky for you, you didn't have to deal with it, right? So COM is basically a technology which Microsoft developed. It's called Common Object Model. So they wanted to call objects which are there out of process, right? That is how it started, right? They used to they created a spec so that, like, whether the object is there in a DLL or a shared library, you will be able to call it. Now, great, people were able to call applications, and that is where, if you know a little bit of tidbit, um, Microsoft really became successful because of COM. What they did was they put COM objects in every single Office application. So every Office application was able to interact with other other Office application. Like, for example, from Word, it is able to talk to Outlook. From Outlook, you're able to talk to PowerPoint, etc., etc. Right? That made the whole Office ecosystem really powerful. And the reason why they were able to do is they were able to reuse the functionalities in each one of those applications effectively. Right? That's what made and no one was able to compete with that. So yeah, so COM was a great technology which made Microsoft successful. If you didn't know, it still exists. You can still, it is there in almost most of the Microsoft products. You can still write a COM component. I don't know how many business users still write it. Then comes yeah, that's great. But once we had LAN and networking, people started saying, okay, I'm not satisfied with doing what calling functions in other process. I want to call it in other machines. That is when we started inventing something called DCOM. So what is DCOM? Distributed COM, right? So it is nothing but calling the same thing. So they had to put additional protocol on top of COM so that they can call it over the network. Then there was, as usual, people in the industry got together and they made a very complex spec called Corba. It took me 1 year to read it. After that, I decided I'm not going to use it anymore, right? So it was yeah, it was great ideas, great things, but it never really took off. People tried to use it and spent a lot of money creating Corba systems, which were never really successful. But there was also the kids who wanted to just get it done. So RPC really worked, right? Like, it was very lightweight, and on the Linux side, they used it a lot, and it was very successful. So RPC was a remote procedure call, and that function really worked. But as usual, it is simple, but it was not easy to use, right? It didn't come with all the tools and rapid prototyping. Then comes the internet. Once we talk about internet, when we talk about the scale, the heterogeneous nature of machines, right? You need to understand, like DCOM, COM, although they were little heterogeneous, they were not truly heterogeneous. That means you can't, it supported only certain operating systems, certain stacks. So SOAP and HTTP were created to work agnostic of your operating system, or agnostic of things. So this is how we evolved to a stage wherein saying that, okay, look, I want to call a piece of function, and everything sort of resulted from this. Now, just to illustrate what happens. So this is, let us say you wrote a beautiful piece of code. Now there are so few functions you're repeating and you want to reuse. So what you refactor them, you put it into a library or a function, and you say, this is my reusable code. Now, if you want to move it across network, and then you basically replace them with a function call and say, okay, now my code has reduced. I just replaced my function call and I'm calling it. But is it right? Is that all it is, right? It is all that is if you're writing a single monolithic applications. The moment you started separating the concerns and going across networks, it's no longer easy. First, what do you need to do? First, you need to pack your variables, right? Like, so if you're not using global variables, you need to sort of copy the variables, you need to create a reference, and if you're going across the network, you need to marshal them, right? If you know the term called marshalling and unmarshalling, it is nothing but serialization, right? Like you need to put them into a JSON format, XML format, and the other side can sort of read it, right? And if you're talking between operating systems, just marshalling is not enough. Even the byte order changes, right? Like what is little endian and big endian is like like when you write an integer, is the first byte the what you can say denotes the largest part of the integer or the smallest part. You don't know. It changes from operating system. If you didn't know, you are lucky, right? We went through so many bugs wherein we didn't even know what we're reading, right? Then marshalling is not enough. Then you need to handle sockets, networking. You need to sort of transmit the marshaled object and unmarshal it, and then call the function, right? And finally, you again unmarshal the result and you sort of read it. Now you look at the code and say, what did I achieve, right? I sort of moved a piece of code and I got this maybe more code to call those functions. So am I really gaining anything, right? So people started saying that, okay, this code is great, but actually making it distributed makes it more complex. So what are the other concerns, right? I talked about marshalling, I talked about networking, but is this the only thing? No, there are so many other things you need to consider when you are talking about distributed systems. For example, scaling, right? What do I mean by scaling, right? Saying that, okay, if the process is, if the function is there inside your process, scaling is quite easy, right? Because the same thread is calling the same function, there's a one-to-one correspondence. You don't have to worry about scaling. Scaling becomes a little bit problem once you started using threads. Then you need to have to make a decision. How many threads I need to have, how many workers I need to have. So you're already thinking about scaling. Now it becomes remote. Now it becomes even more problematic. You're saying that how many processes I need to have, how many out of process I need to have, because I don't know how many clients are going to be. Now it becomes across the machines. Now you're going to talk in terms of how many machines do I need to have and how many processes I need to have in that. So once you sort of decide and you get a hang of it, so I sorted this out. I totally figured it out. I know how many processes, how many instances, how many machines I need. But then comes the next problem, right? Saying that, okay, who will manage the life cycle of all this, right? When will I start the process? When will I kill the process? When will I create a machine? When will I remove the machine? Then you need to start thinking about that. Then comes deployment. Okay, now if I have so many machines, who will put the code in it? Every time I change the code, how will I put it into those machines? How will I make a machine ready with my latest code? And if I have to replace the code, if I already have 100 machines, it's a nightmare. Is the code already running? Is someone using it? Like, how do I kill the what do you say, finish the request before I come and replace it? Then comes the next part is discovery, right? This becomes very interesting, right? Now you have so many machines and so many remote code, distributed code running. You need to find where the code is. Like if you have like thousands of machines and then each one is running hundreds of services, which code runs in which machine? You can hard code it, right? You can say this machine contains this. Then that is not truly error free, because like if that machine goes down, you need to go to the other machine. So discovery becomes an important part, right? Like how do I sort of discover where my service is? Then comes the monitoring part. Okay, fine, I just talked about errors. So you need to monitor to know which machine is down, which service is down, which process is down, so that you can sort of recover it. All of this in single process, it doesn't matter, right? If the single process dies, your function also dies, right? Like right? But in case of the distributor, all these things becomes complex. Next comes is recovery, right? Okay, yes. Now I monitored. I know the system is down. I monitored. Now it's consuming more memory. You need to have a recovery procedure. That means there should be a recovery process which will either reboot the system, it will create the service again, or it will what you can say, it will create a new machine, etc. Then comes the grand old daddy, right? Once the code is not running in your own machine, you need to worry about security. Who is calling that function? Who is allowed to call the function? What is that function doing? What can it modify, not modify, becomes very crucial, because now the calls are coming remotely. So you need to authenticate the call, you need to authorize the call, and then you need to see what is allowed and what is not allowed, right? That becomes the policy. Now your administrators will say, look, I need to control how the access is, not the person who wrote the code. So there must be a policy applied on top of it. Now we quickly see, right, like the moment you sort of distribute your microservice, it's no longer easy about just calling a function. You need to take care of all these things. Now, is that all, right? No, that is not all. There is a lot more to it. Now, having all this, people have come up with this brilliant contraception called SOA. Again, I'll envy all the people who didn't have to work with SOA. I think the current generation must have heard it as a theoretical construct. Some of us out here had to fight with it every day. So SOA is basically what they said is, we'll solve all these problems for you. Don't worry. The blue part is your service. You write it, but everything else will be solved for you. And how will it be solved? I'll give you a set of libraries and I'll give you a set of constraints which you will work on, and everything will be orchestrated by this mega machine in between called ESB, right? That is great. Like you're saying that, okay, you are taking care of all my pain. All I need to be is like say that, oh God, you are my humble, what you can say, king, and I will be your servant. That is all great in theory, but what happens quickly is when people started doing the agile development, ESB became a pain in the neck, right? Because every time you needed to do a change, you need to go to the king, put an application in triplicate, and there must be an enterprise architecture team which will determine whether what has to change or not change. Quickly, it became the biggest bottleneck in most of the companies, right? Nothing could move because everything got jammed in ESB. That's what happened. It was supposed to actually make it smoother, but it just made it like a, imagine if someone built a city like Bangalore and said that all the roads should go through MG Road, right? Wait a second, that's what they did, right? Okay, that's so you understand what's going to happen. That's exactly what's happening, right? So everyone goes to one road and say that that's great. Like, so the traffic has to stand, or police has to stand only in MG Road. They don't have to be anywhere, and we'll control everything. You know how that is going to work out, and that's exactly happened with SOA. So in SOA, what happened is the ESB was the master, and everyone was slave. So they used to call it smart pipes and dumb endpoints. Dumb endpoints are your services, right? Your SOAP services mostly. Then came the next architecture saying that, okay, people became smarter. They started adopting these principles of keep it simple, don't repeat yourself, you don't need all the stuff which ESB is giving, you need to separate your concerns, etc., etc. Now, after these principles, what people did, they came up with this architecture. They said that, look, we'll have smart endpoints and dumb pipes. That means like the application developer decides what you can say, what libraries to use, and what all the concerns. I'll take care of it using libraries, so that like each microservice is its own destiny, right? Like now they can control what it is. The infrastructure is just transferring stuff from one place to another and connecting stuff, right? It is just doing dumb pipe. That means like the pipes of let us say of your city, right? Like what goes inside the pipes, no one knows. Whether it's clean water, dirty water, they don't care. All they do is like they have plumbing which lets you sort of go in. Now this worked great for lots of times, but as the systems became more complex, these libraries became the gray boxes became bigger and bigger, right? As I just talked to you about, it is no longer about just the concerns. You have other concerns which came up, right? They said, okay, now we figured out how to do marshalling, unmarshalling, security, and all those. Then what about this? People started writing async APIs, and they're saying, okay, what about call sequencing? What about multicasting? What about orchestration? Like if I have one service calls multiple service and one of the service fails, how do I do? How do I aggregate the responses? How do I transform the messages, right? Like how do I insist on consistency? How do I insist on retries, duplication? Initially, people started having libraries like Hystrix, some of you must be aware of, like which handle some of those automatic retries, exceptional, what you can say, exponential fall-offs, etc., etc., and they were able to give it. And then they started putting caching libraries. Then you started putting what you can say, use GraphQL kind of stuff to do aggregates, etc., etc. Now, all this works in small scale and to a certain extent, but very soon you will realize that you are building an ESB inside your microservice, right? That is what is going to happen, right? Each microservice will become heavy if it has to handle all of that. So people were scratching their head saying, okay, ESB is not the answer, but building an ESB in each one of the microservices is not the answer. So how do I get something better at that? So we started with principle. Whenever you have problems, you state, okay, let us start with a principle and then work backwards. So the principle which worked for all the successful companies like Netflix, Amazon, and Google is, they said like, look, let us not design for failure, right? Like I will design for recovery. What it means is, let us not try to make it fail proof, right? Like they're saying that, okay, it'll handle every single exception case and all. Instead, what they said is, I want to sort of handle in such a way that if something happens, I know how to recover, right? So they said, okay, like if what you can say, scaling is a problem, or if a service dies, that's okay. All I need to know is how to bring up 10 more services quickly, right? If I can bring 10 services quickly, more than trying to fix a recovery which takes 1 minute, whereas if I can take 1 second to bring a service up, that is the method I'm going to prepare. So with this concept of design for recovery, these are the things which people came up with, saying that, okay, well, if we have to design for recovery, these are the things I need to do. How do I can recover the fastest? First thing they said is, like, your service should be idiopatent to restarts. What does it mean? It means that, like, if your service starts, there is nothing called a state in which a service handles, right? Like, so no matter if the service starts, it will just can pick up where it what you can say, if a new request comes, it starts processing the new request, right? It doesn't have any bearing on when it started or when it came to life, right? That's what it means. Second thing is, it should be idiopatent to scaling up or down. That means if a service can handle n requests or n plus 2 requests or n minus 1 requests, it doesn't matter, right? There's no fixed kind of stuff. It will handle horizontally scaling. Then it has to be a idiopatent producer and idiopatent consumer. Now, these two things, what it means is, as a producer, right? Like, let us take a REST service which is updating a piece of record. Now, if there are multiple updates coming in, if the same update message comes twice, it should update the record only once, right? Like, or the end state should still remain the same. It should not matter how many times the update happens. The same thing with consumer, right? If you have an API, if you call a service and you get a return result, and you get the return result twice, your program should be tolerant to that, right? Like, because it's for the same request, you can get the same responses no matter how many times you sort of call. So you need to design both your consumer, producer, and your for scaling and restarts, right? It needs to be resistant to that, right? So what it means mainly is, like, you deal with your state properly. You deal with versioning, right? You deal with, like, whenever you're updating, you update from a particular state to particular state, right? So those things happen. You will achieve this. Next comes, no, taking all these principles, people have come up with the next architecture, wherein what they said is, so let us take all this, what we call is that ESB concerns, which I sort of told you. And these concerns, they are not running inside your code, but they're running inside a sidecar, right? If you understand what a sidecar is, it's basically a container which runs next to your container, right? And which will handle most of your, what you can say, infrastructure concerns. So in this, and it is specially applied in the cases of Istio and Kubernetes. So what they do it here is, okay, let us handle the security, policy, marshalling, unmarshalling, discovery, all the concerns which I talked about. They handle it in this place, and which will make the life easier for you. So in this case, what happens is, the proxy itself, it is not like every service is creating it. Every service is actually instantiating the proxy again and again. So you are not creating an ESB per service. You are actually what do you say? You have the flexibility of using a different proxy or this one. So you are not controlled by a central entity. You are still master of your destiny. You can decide what sidecar you want to sort of create in for your service, and that is how you control, right? You don't have to be too heavy. If all you're interested is in security, your sidecar will contain only security. If all you're interested is in discovery, that is the only thing which you can have within your sidecar. You don't have to have every single thing. But if the central ESB is there, people always ask me, what is the difference between this and ESB? In central ESB, everything applies, whether you like it or not, because everyone needs it. They have to sort of do this. Here you have control. So the control is still there with the individual agile teams which are doing the microservice. They can control what gets deployed and what is the sidecar and all those things. But the central team also can control what are the things that they will make it available for people to pick and choose from their catalog. So this is the happy balance which we are currently running in. So if you talk about, they call it SOA, which is service-oriented architecture, MSA, which is your microservices architecture. Now we are there in cloud native architecture. In cloud native architecture, this is the state we are there in. The next architecture, which I'm not going to talk because it's not exactly microservices, is basically serverless architecture, right? Serverless architecture is in which this whole proxy mesh and everything is managed for you, right? Like that means individual teams don't have control over the proxy. They don't have control over the what you can say, the service mesh, right? So that is the difference of serverless, wherein you're purely writing your functions and everything else is managed for you. Now you can ask me, how is it different than SOA? The difference is serverless architecture is a little bit more uh, platform agnostic. It gives you, and it is more lightweight in terms of what you have to sort of know, right? In terms of writing your service. Now let me go to what other concerns actually we need to understand. Now, if you take about any business logic, the infrastructure concerns are all what I call in the gray area out here, right? Now, your business logic needs networking, which you all know, right? Which is service discovery. We need to service discovery is just the initial part of it, which is basically I need to know where my service is and how to access it. But there are a lot more in terms of networking you need to do. If you're doing A/B testing, you need to know whether you should go to the A instance or B instance. If you're doing canary rollout, you need to know what percentage of the request need to go. Then you need to sort of know about retries, right? If something fails, do I go to the next instance or you have to retry the same service, right? And point to point security observability, all these things will fall under networking. Then in binding, it comes about like what protocol, right? Like you're calling a REST service and it has a gRPC endpoint. Are you going to do the translation, or you want the sidecar to do the translation, right? So that can happen. And then transaction. What is transaction? Transaction means you're saying that I'm calling these three services, all of them should succeed, or the transaction should fail. That means if one of the services fails in between, the infrastructure will take care of calling that service again until it passes. Now, these are all idiopatent services, so they can call any number of times until all three succeed. Then it will say transaction is completed. If it's not able to succeed after a certain number of retries and follow-ups, it will say transaction has failed. So you're doing a distributed transaction across microservice, but your code doesn't have to worry about it, right? You're doing it at a sidecar level. So and then state is again, right? Like how do you manage your caching, right? For example, your sidecar might decide, right? I'll use the cache header and I'll decide that I don't even have to call the header, because last time I called you, there was a cache header which says that the cache expires at say in 5 minutes, and now you called it before 5 minutes. I don't even have to make a network call, and I'll return you the value which I have cached, right? So as an application developer, you don't have to worry about it. Why do you have to deal with it, right? Because it's a standard mechanism of dealing with cache headers. Let the proxy take care of it. Now, that is just an example. Now, to do all this, now we have, what we have is, instead of having a single vendor like an ESB or an Oracle Fusion, right, which is like a TIBCO ESB or an Oracle Fusion doing all of this, we have a bunch of components so that we can pick and choose. Because what is the current trend is, it is not about one company trying to do all the things. It is because multiple small companies. This is the same thing which is happening even in big enterprises versus startups, right? Like you have multiple small startups doing one concern really well. So as a developer, I can choose, saying that okay, for my sidecars and like for networking and all, I want to use Istio, right? For my orchestration, I'll use Camel, right? For my state, I'll use Dapper or like Cloud State or something like that, right? So which makes you in control of you, when I say you as a developer in control of what technology you can use, and you are not tied to anything. And all of these guys work on standards which are like the cloud native federation, which is coming up with a bunch of standards, and all of them operate in that, which makes it easier for you to sort of run this on something like a Kubernetes, and all of them are guaranteed to sort of work for you, right? Yeah, of course, there will still be some differences, but it makes your life a lot easier. Now, having all this said, so how does your architecture look like? So if you look at your architecture, this is how now the layers got divided, right? Now your business logic itself can be a polyglot. That means like you can write it in any language, you can write it in any framework, because it is simple enough, right? That it just takes care of very basic stuff. And all the out of process infrastructure concerns, you're using different packages, like to handle scaling, like you use Knative, for example, right? In order to handle what you can say distributed state abstraction, you use Dapper. Like in order to use traffic routing, you can use Envoy or Istio or whatever it is, right? So by doing this, now you are taking what is in process is your business logic, what is your sidecar is your infrastructure runtime, and then you have your infrastructure. Now what someone called it is Mecca. Now, if everyone knows what Mecca is, right? Yeah, if it was a live audience, I could have got some nods and all that, but I have, I'm assuming all of you are nodding. Mecca is nothing but like if you've seen Transformers or if you've seen the other robotic movies wherein you have an external exoskeleton which makes you 10 times stronger than what you are, right? Then that is what we need to become. All our service should use these components to become the next version of what it can do. And just to illustrate that, I want to sort of put this thing. For your Black Friday. So all of you have seen that you have destroyed your all your requests. I meant you served all your requests, but you get the idea. Now you are ready. You have all the equipment in the world to sort of do that. Okay, so finally, I want to end by thanking you all for your time. Hopefully, you appreciated some of the reasons why microservices have evolved in this architecture, and you can do better decisions going forward. Okay, thank you, everyone.